important partners time to gather that input. And there will be time for you after today's session after you've had a chance to digest a little bit and think about it, to provide additional feedback through April 1st. So we really want to make sure that this is a collaborative effort to get your feedback, to provide input and share needs to support the work moving forward. So in terms of our agenda today, we will move into introductions next, and then we will spend a little bit of time talking about Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act requirements related to MOUs and IFAs. So a little bit of context setting for the discussion that we want to have for you today. We will talk about the work that has been accomplished to date related to MOUs and IFAs in Iowa. And then we'll review the draft policy recommendations related to the updates to the MOU policy to incorporate IFAs. And then we have blocked a good chunk of time for discussion with you. That's really our objective here today, is to hear from you, get your questions, get your input around ways that we can be supportive moving forward. And we'll share a little bit about what's coming down the pike over the next several months. So in terms of meeting logistics, as I said, we have a good chunk of time today, and we'll be together until 11:30. So we really want to hear from you in terms of your questions and feedback. Please share them in the chat as we go through our conversation today. And we will be looping back to those. So know that anything that you put in chat, we've got dedicated time to come back to, and we will follow up so that we have a chance to discuss all of those questions. But we did want to share with you at the outset some of the discussion questions that we would like to focus on with you today, so you can kind of have these in mind as we move through our time together today. So certainly first, just overarching questions, any general questions or kind of overarching questions that you want to make sure that we discuss today. Areas in which you or your local partners might need additional information around IFA, the IFA policy, the proposed updates. We want to hear from you around any potential challenges or concerns that you want to share today so that we can begin thinking about those. We want to hear about how the state core partners can support you and your other local partners moving forward with IFA development. We would love to hear about any lessons learned from the work that you did to develop MOUs locally that we can bring into the work to develop IFAs. And then finally, we certainly want to hear about training and technical assistance needs, in addition to those that we'll share with you that are already being planned right now. So I would just keep those questions in mind as we move through our conversation today. These are all areas that we would love to hear from you about. So we would love to do introductions. In the interest of time, we're going to do that in the chat. If you all would take a moment to share your name and your role in the local workforce development area that you're a part of, that would be great. We would also love it if you would be willing to share how familiar you currently are with WIOA, MOU, and infrastructure funding agreements. So if you're very familiar, somewhat familiar, not very, that's just helpful information for us as we go through the day so that we can really focus on content that maybe needs more attention and not go over things that you all might be quite familiar with. And we would love to see if you have any burning questions at the outset today.
At this time, I do not.
Like to prioritize those questions that you've come into today's sessions with so that we can really spend time in discussion on those. So if you all could take a moment and start to introduce yourselves in the chat, we would love to hear from you. Great, thank you. And I see that folks are doing that. Just take a minute to take a look here. Great, lots of partners here with us today. This is great. Welcome, everyone. Okay. Some of you are chiming in with your level of familiarity around MOUs and IFAs. Thank you, that's really helpful. Some not familiar, some a little bit familiar, some familiarity around the MOU requirements, not the IFA, makes perfect sense. Just taking a look here. Okay, great. Great. We'll keep that coming. We're going to move ahead, but keep, let us know how familiar you are. If you do have any burning questions, we'll keep an eye in the chat as we move forward today. So before we dig in, just want to talk a little bit about kind of our orientation for this session and the way we've approached the previous sessions for consultation, and really the way that the core partner team has approached development of the proposed policy updates has been from this customer-centered, partnership-based system. So we know you all are coming as local boards, as local board partners, into this work where you'll be playing a critical role in developing your IFAs at the local level. So you're kind of wearing a couple of different hats in terms of today's session. You know, you're going to be responsible for facilitating development of IFAs. Today, we're also asking you to come into this session with kind of a statewide system perspective that's really driven by what are the ways that IFA policy guidance can best support local areas in doing what they need to do from a service delivery perspective and a funding perspective to support their communities and their customers. So we're asking you to kind of keep both of those hats on today, you know, thinking about your own local roles, certainly, but we're really asking you to help today in designing IFA policy guidance that will best support systems locally across the state and really do the best, same with the MOU work that you did previously to support meeting the needs of customers at the local level. So these are just kind of principles that we've kept in mind throughout the many months that this work has been ongoing, you know, sort of playing those dual roles around being a program partner, being a local area negotiator or leader, but then also in this capacity today, really being kind of an architect with helping to design and provide input to policy that will help you locally. So that's how we've been approaching it. And let's see. Oh, and I think, Darcy, I will turn it over to you now. And just a logistical note, there was a little bit of background noise. If you're not speaking, if you wouldn't mind just muting yourselves as we move forward. And please do continue to keep your feedback and your questions coming in the chat.
Thanks, Gretchen, and good morning, everyone. Before we go into just the broader context of what are the requirements under the law for your MOUs and your IFAs, we'll start there so we're all on the same page with what we have to do. Then Wendy will share a little bit of the Iowa context, the timeline, the work that has been done and where we're going with that. And then we'll dig into those policy recommendations from the core partner working group. And because I have control of the slides, I'm going to go back one to just really emphasize one aspect of this part of our work together in system building. And to me, I think the challenge in MOUs and IFAs is not the policy or putting together a document. This is really one of the most system level pieces of work that we get to do collaboratively between state and local areas, and most importantly through that partnership. So I think being able to continue to come back to this perspective, and this is a message we've shared with all of the partners that we've presented to and your elected officials in other consultation sessions too, is to remember which hat you're wearing, that when you come to the work of developing your MOU, your IFA, and your one-step operating budget, you are coming and this is local area work. So you're not wearing your state program hat, but ultimately we're all doing this work together for this broader system and in the service to the individuals coming through our doors and coming to receive the services we provide. So I just really think that this is a helpful way to start and enter into this work and to keep that bigger picture in mind. In terms of the context, so what is required from the law, we're going to really quickly look at what is the MOU, the IFA, and the relationship between those and what they're designed to do. So the Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, is an agreement between your chief lead elected official, your local workforce board, and each one-stop partner in your local area. And this agreement outlines the operation of your one-stop delivery system for your local area and identifies the role that each partner will play. So the questions that the MOU is ultimately answering is, how are we providing services and how are we funding our system to fulfill this vision of how service is delivered for our local area? The infrastructure funding agreement is a part of the MOU. So you have to think of them not as these two separate things or separate documents. The infrastructure funding agreement is a component that really just details the financial plan to fund those services and operating costs of the system. So if your system design is we're going to have a receptionist, or we're going to have valet parking or TVs on the front or whatever it is, then your IFA is funding is that financial plan for how that works. In terms of responsibilities for carrying out this work, the local workforce board, as that convening function that you all carry out, are responsible for negotiating and developing the memorandum of understanding, which includes that one-stop operating budget and the infrastructure funding agreement. Typically, the board will utilize its board staff to convene partners to complete this task. Now, because we just saw that partners and chief lead elected officials are signers and are coming to agreement in this work, they have to agree and sign those documents indicating that. In terms of specifically the infrastructure funding piece, there are a couple of pieces that are additional responsibilities described in the law for local boards and chief elected official. And this is specific to the infrastructure funding component of the overall MOU. So the local board and chief elected officials have a responsibility to ensure that the one-stop partners adhere to the guidance on one-stop delivery system infrastructure costs. They have a responsibility to work with one-stop partners to achieve consensus and informally mediate any possible conflicts or disagreements in those negotiations and the development of those documents, as well as providing technical assistance to new one-stop partners or new local grant recipients to ensure that they're informed and knowledgeable about the contents of that MOU and the infrastructure cost agreement. Regarding contributions, who must contribute is designed by the type of center that you're developing these agreements around. So for a comprehensive center, infrastructure costs must be paid by all required one-stop partners in the local area, regardless of co-location at that center. So if they're physically there, or if they're maintaining that direct linkage or virtual presence, they are still participating in infrastructure costs for a comprehensive one-stop center. For additional shared costs, then it's the required partners who have agreed to share in those costs of career services or other shared services. If your center is certified as an affiliated or a specialized center, then the infrastructure costs are paid by only those partners engaged in the given center, and the same as comprehensive additional shared costs are the engaged partners who agree to share in the costs. Your policy for center certification process defines and identifies your types of one-stop centers. So this is not new information, but you in the state of Iowa, a comprehensive center is where titles 1 and 3 are present full-time with one other core partner present at least part-time. And the center is providing access to all programs, services, activities of the partners who may not be physically co-located in that center. Your affiliated centers are defined as where 2 or more core partners are present, with at least one of the core partners present on a full-time basis. And then your satellite center is a location where a core or required partner is present on a permanent basis, with the note that titles 1 and 3 are not eligible to have a standalone office or be considered a satellite center. So these are the places that we are talking about. This is where that infrastructure is going to live when we're looking at pulling together these costs and working with our local partners to spread out those costs. And there will always be a relationship between center certification by way of defining the type of center, and then the next step of funding those centers, and all under the vision that you've established in your memorandum of understanding. Before we go, and maybe transitioning into Iowa's progress to date, what have we done, where are we, and what's coming next? I think I only saw one question pop up in the chat, and we'll pause if there are any other just on this base level piece. What is causing areas to not have the MOU or differences from other states? So it's my understanding that all local areas have developed and have executed a memorandum of understanding. But the next part is to develop the infrastructure funding agreement component of the MOU. And at the time of the implementation of WIOA, this is the model that most states followed. You'll see in state policy, they issued like a part 1 of the MOU to develop that just vision of shared costs and services, which is the work that you all have done. And then a second component, a second piece of now working to fund that system together. So you've done things in the right order. I think just in terms of the timing of it, that's what Wendy can give a little more insight to in terms of Iowa's journey. But before I pass that virtual microphone over to her, is the slide presentation posted? I'll be able to access it now later. I believe we shared a draft of these slides either with the calendar holder prior to this meeting, but if not, we will follow up to ensure that you have access to the slides, the recordings, and any additional resources or documents for this conversation. All right. Wendy, I'm going to pass it to you.
Thanks, Darcy. Hi, everybody. As I said at the beginning of this session, my name is Wendy Greenman. I am a bureau chief with the Workforce Services Division at Iowa Workforce Development, and I oversee the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act Title I programs, adult dislocated worker and youth. So we have been working pretty diligently for quite some time with our core partner group at the state level. We have a core partner working group that we meet. Hopefully, it depends, typically every week or every other week on a lot of these different subjects. So when I talk through all of this, please know it was all done together as a state core partner working group, titles 1, 2, 3, and 4. So that group came together and we wrote and executed MOU policy that was published in January of 2021. We then supplemented that with some additional guidance with local board information. It was included on the state board website. So with that, we included a template, an MOU template, as well as guidance back in March of 2021. We also provided a Q&A session in April subsequent to that being released so that we could provide some additional information and guidance at that time. As Darcy said, every local area does have an MOU in place to date. This is following up and adding the IFA component into it. That's what we're talking about now. The group also worked together to deliver one-stop certification standards and training. That was held in June of 2022 with local stakeholders. And I just want to preface all of this by saying we have received several different areas of feedback from the Department of Labor since 2017, I think, is when we received our first DOL finding related to MOUs. So we've been working on this for quite some time, making sure that we have the policy in place, guidance in place, and we're adding all of the relevant pieces. More recently, DOL has come back to us and said, we will continue receiving findings across the states and across the partners in relation to non-compliant MOUs until this IFA piece is implemented. And so that's one reason why we're really making sure that we're getting this going and have some other pieces in place so that we can, you know, have a compliant MOU and IFA structure in Iowa. Do you want to go on to the next slide, Darcy? Awesome. So this is a little bit of a roadmap visual of some of those pieces that I just talked about. So for the IFA, those core partners, we met to develop process guidance really between September and October of 2022. And in December of 2022, we came together and finalized that IFA policy and recommendations, and of course, supporting resources that go along with that. Moving on, February to April 2023, that's what we're doing right now. We're having these consultation sessions with required partners, the CEOs, local workforce development areas, and then we will follow up this session and any feedback with having a consultation session with the state board. We're hoping to have updated policy guidance issued and provided out to everyone, approved by the state board in June of this year, and then follow that up with some additional supporting resources to be issued for your use as well. Our target implementation date of having IFA integrated and ready to roll is June 1st of 2024. So that would be in coordination with putting out the PY24 funds. I'll ask my core partner group now if there's anything I missed that you would like to follow up in sharing. If not, is it okay, Darcy, if I pause here and see if anyone has any questions on the historical piece? Perfect. Or our timeline? Thank you for putting that link in the policy, Darcy, or in the chat where the policy is. Great.
Right.
Hearing none, Darcy, I'll turn it back over to you.
Perfect. And I have seen a few questions pop through the chat that I'm hoping we may get to get answered in this next part of our session. So if those answers aren't coming or those questions are still lingering for you, then please bring those back up. But the next piece is to actually talk about the recommended changes to your current MOU policy. So the link in the chat is the current policy that you all have had and has been approved for the development of your memorandums of understanding. And then we'll go through the big picture changes of that. And I think a document that may have previously been shared for this meeting, but will also be shared again as a follow-up just for your review and convenience, is going to be a Word document that has the every, here's your current policy, here's a proposed change. If it's there, it should have that side-by-side comparison for you for the purpose of our consultation session. I pulled out the biggest ones and the buckets that your core partner team really made the most substantial recommendations or updates to your policy. And those are the ones I want to voice over to give the context for what that change is, the reason for that change, and then give you all a chance to respond to that. And in terms of these policy update recommendations, they're really in 3 areas. So one is the process for developing your memorandum of understanding. One is the process for changing it if or when change is needed. And the other is in terms of expectations for negotiation, how to really support and maximize the very important local area conversations and negotiations needed to agree to these shared funding components. So, and then after we talk about the policy, we'll chat a little bit about the supporting resources for implementation. So the resources we've developed to give you, again, additional context on definitions, terms, step-by-step how-to, those parts that live as resources outside of the policy language. So first, our first big bucket is in terms of developing your MOU and the local process for developing your one-stop operating budget and your infrastructure funding agreement. And what you'll see throughout these slides is any just black text that's standard is what your current policy already has in it. And the blue italicized text is going to reflect recommended language to add to that policy. So one of the federal requirements for the state guidance on infrastructure funding is to include models or examples for the cost allocation methodology. So as you and your core partners are coming together and say, here's the list of costs that we need to divide, how are we dividing them? How are we going to ensure that everyone is paying their fair share and their equitable share? And so the recommendation is to update your current policy language with those blue examples there. And these are the typical ones that we've seen most commonly used for developing infrastructure funding agreements across the state. So examples include based on the number of customers served. If I have 5 people come in for my program and you have 10 people come in for yours, what I'm paying is proportionate to the 5 people I've served. What you're paying is proportionate to the 10 people you've served. An additional example could be based on square footage. What is my actual footprint? How much office space or shared break room space, things like that, if we're dividing things that way. Or another option is full-time equivalent staff. At the local level, you all will determine that cost allocation methodology for your area, for your center, and among your local level partners. These are examples. The second piece in terms of developing is in regard to what is the required content information that must be included in either an infrastructure funding agreement or any other type of cost sharing agreement. And so the period of time it's effective, the description of the processes to resolve issues, just that required content that must be there. Your current policy had this as 2 separate sections, one for infrastructure funding and one for other cost sharing agreements. The required information is both, regardless of which type of agreement it is. So we just recommended condensing it to give you a little bit shorter of a policy. Nothing too big in terms of development. The bigger changes ironically happen in the category or the bucket of changing your MOU, changing your infrastructure funding agreement. So your current policy actually includes a definition of a substantial change. And so regarding a financial amount or a percentage of your infrastructure funding agreement, your current MOU policy cites that a more than 5 or 10% deviation of an allocation percentage would be considered a substantial change. So for example, if you budget a certain amount for snow removal in the parking lot of your center, and man, you got a lot more snow this year than you thought you would, and that bill is much higher than you expected, if it's falling in beyond that, in that 5% deviation, a substantial change is a thing that could trigger needing to renegotiate and re-sign your infrastructure funding agreement. The challenge here is that 5 to 10% in budget allocations for one partner could be substantially different for others because we have a combination of very large and very small partners in our systems at the local level. The other challenge is that not every change or change trigger is going to be something that can be measured as a percentage. So the US Department of Labor sample MOU and infrastructure cost toolkit lists examples of substantial changes that would require a renewal of your MOU. And it could even be something like, if we add a new partner to our center, well, that could be substantial in terms of the impact of, here's someone else that can participate in sharing costs. That will have an effect on every other partner in that center. By the same token, removing if a partner leaves your center, well, the costs that they were previously contributing now would need to be absorbed by the current partners there. So there are types of substantial changes that are a little bit beyond the scope of this definition. So the update to the policy will be to remove this specific definition of a substantial change as the one and only, as a main thing that can trigger the change process. At a local level, you all could choose to add definition or add specifics in your MOU around defining a substantial change if this was something that you and your local partners wanted to keep as part of the agreement that could trigger needing to renegotiate or re-sign the agreement. I'm not seeing questions. So before I talk about change process, the other thing is in terms of reconciliation. So you make your budget, but then as those invoices start coming in, you have to reconcile your budget against the actual costs that are being incurred. And your current MOU policy speaks to that reconciliation process slightly. It's a little bit confusing in terms of how to change your MOU or when do you need to change it. It talks about calculating for statistical fluctuations, again, probably tied to that definition that you had previously of substantial change. The reality is at the local level, you all need to determine your own process for reconciliation. And that does not have to look the same for every single local area. Part of negotiating and developing your MOU locally will be determining your reconciliation process. So it's, as far as the state policy piece goes, it's that you have to have a reconciliation process, but it doesn't have to prescribe for you what that looks like. So the updated language is that the one-stop operating budget must be periodically reconciled against actual costs incurred and adjusted accordingly. As part of the MOU development process, local areas need to develop a process for periodic review and reconciliation of the one-stop operating budget against actual costs incurred. Best practices that we see in local areas across the state is planning to do that monthly or quarterly. And this was also on that list of what is required in the agreement anyway. You know, you're in your agreement, you're specifying your reconciliation process. And then you're adjusting that budget accordingly through a change process, either through an amendment, modification, or renewal, which I'll talk about in just a moment. And then as a local area, you're ensuring that a current MOU, so if any changes do happen to your MOU, you're just sending that to IWD to have on file as those changes are made. Questions here? I'm going to pause for a quick sip of water, and then we'll talk more about change. Okay, the next piece of change really and the policy update language falls around defining these types of change as a modification, an amendment, or a renewal. And your previous policy did not specify change by type and what the implications of those changes were or the process for knowing which kind of change you're following. So I'm going to use this visual to explain or describe those three pieces. And then in the policy itself, it'll have the definitions aligned to how I've described them. On the left-hand side of this graphic, you see examples of what could trigger a need to change your MOU. So we just talked about that periodic reconciliation. Again, as you're looking at the actual cost versus what you budgeted, you're seeing something, you know, you're using a lot more than budgeted for one thing or a lot less for something else. That's one thing that could trigger change. There's also a requirement to annually review your MOU as a whole. Maybe in doing that, you make an adjustment to your approach to delivery of services. Maybe you're going to do something more virtually or more in person than previously. Changing that vision or changing your service delivery can have those cost implications that could require a change in other parts of the MOU. Your policy also provides that a signatory of the MOU, so a local partner, chief elected official, or local board, could request a change. And so those would be things triggering a change process. And there are three types of changes that can happen as a result of that. I'm going to start with the bottom row, which is a renewal. A renewal would be the largest type of change of your MOU because it's a substantial change that also requires renegotiation. This could be deciding to move the location of your center. So a lot of things are changing there. Maybe the cost of rent overall, maybe your square footage is changing, maybe even the number or which partners are moving with you or not moving with you. That's a really big change that has big impacts to both your service delivery and to your budget. So the biggest type of change, you would renew the full part of your MOU, you would get new signatures on that, and you would notify IWD that you have renewed your MOU. The other two types of change really follow just more standard contract policies or pieces. So I'm going to go next to the top row. So you've determined that renegotiation among all partners is not required, and it's probably a non-substantial change. So this is a modification. This is the only option where you would not need new signatures. And a modification is defined and will be defined in your policy update as a change that does not alter the overall meaning or substance of the provisions of the agreement. So the parties in the MOU will review it to know that, oh yeah, we thought this would be $100, it was actually $104. But you don't need to bring everyone together to renegotiate over those $4. And then a modification, they review and agree to what has changed. They wouldn't need to re-sign everything. Modification is probably what might be most likely to happen through that periodic reconciliation process, unless there had been some big changes to maybe changes to like security needs or like health and safety, like really changing the services that you're delivering or needing for your center, you're likely going the route of modification. If there is a substantial change, but it's not necessarily a full renegotiation, then you're looking at an amendment. And an amendment does need new signatures because they're really, under an amendment, you're adding, deleting, or editing terms in your contract that, that changes the spirit of the agreement. I think this is mostly the things that you realize you need to account for now, as maybe things in your center have changed since when you previously developed this agreement. I can think of examples from Oklahoma where I am, where some centers for a short amount of time maybe needed to have an increase in security presence, and that was a new service added to be shared among partners, or additional protocols for like health and safety regarding sanitation or screening or different things like that. And maybe for whatever reason, you might be temporarily seeing a very high volume of clients in your local area if there's a big layoff or something like that. That just may cause a bigger change to how services being provided. So you're bringing people together to review and agree to the elements that have been changed and re-sign for that purpose. So to reflect these definitions or this process for change, and in the slide deck, we have a couple extra slides that have the exact policy language and the side by side. But this is the biggest piece of just saying, these are the 3 types of change, and these are the 3 paths to follow if you are changing your MOU. And I want to get to our last bucket around negotiation. So if a local board reports an impasse in infrastructure funding negotiations at any point, whether it's this, you're developing this, you're making a change, and there is not that consensus and agreement under what's called the local funding mechanism, there is an option to trigger a state funding mechanism. And this is one of the most clearly and specifically described things in WIOA in terms of process, expectations, and procedures. And under a state funding mechanism scenario, what would happen is instead of the local area and local partners coming together to negotiate their contributions, the governor will do that. So the information is given to the governor. The governor has some formulas and things like that to develop all of this for a local area. The state funding mechanism is not ideal. It's the worst case scenario because it takes away the flexibility from you all as a local area to design how services should be delivered to your participants. It also takes away that flexibility from partner programs in terms of how their funds should be spent. So from the federal to the regional office and to all of your state partners, they want to be brought in before at any point where negotiation breaks down to be able to support and preserve the local funding mechanism piece. And that comes directly from your Region 5 Department of Labor office. They say that, you know, if negotiation breakdown is happening, bring in the state, bring in your state partners to try to help you, bring us in to try to help you before notifying the governor that we have reached an impasse and we cannot complete this responsibility. So the added language here under negotiation is really to just convey that message of support that this is the route to go to continue to work through your local funding mechanism. And then it also includes the added process components of if we get to the piece where we trigger the state funding mechanism, this is the timeline for notification of the governor. This is the list of materials to be provided to the governor, the timeline for the governor to make a decision. Those pieces all come directly from the federal law. Your state plan also is required to describe the process for triggering a state funding mechanism scenario. So we brought that language from your state plan into your policy just to close that communication loop. Before I talk about implementation, support, resources, this is the policy piece, just telling you what you need to do. And then that will be the, how can we help you do this work? I want to pause to see if questions are coming in. I see one that just came through the chat. Colleges across 3 local areas and funding buckets allowed to pull these from for Title II. So to the first part of the question, yes, you would be participating in 3 local areas for their infrastructure funding agreement and MOU development. In terms of the funding bucket for Title II, I would direct to your Title II state partner. And I'm not sure if all of our state partners joined today. So I know I saw in some of the burning questions coming in, like what's an infrastructure cost? What counts for this? What counts for that? Those are questions that we have sought to answer in some of your supporting implementation resources. So let me talk through those, and then we'll be ready to open the floor and answer any unasked questions or even just hear some thoughts from you all. Because I don't want to just leave you, here's this really big fun thing to do and go forth and have fun. Let's talk about resources and what's being made available to you to actually be able to get from where you are today to that timeline of July 2024, where you will have completed this process and have a complete MOU with the infrastructure funding agreement in it. So on the left-hand side, I know when your current MOU policy came out, it also came out with a template guidance. I think there was a Q&A session or maybe even an ongoing PDF with questions and answers that are available on your state board website under the local board information piece. And I think that was about like a 15-page guide that showed kind of the sample language, had some recommendations of like a timeline, like how, you know, what information do you need to gather How long should I expect this to take? How many meetings to schedule? Those types of things. What we have done to now add the additional components for infrastructure funding and development of your one-stop operating budget is updated that current guide. So I think we went from about 15 pages before, we're pushing 50 right now. There's a chance we might get slightly over 50 to just make it a more robust resource that includes key terms and definitions, examples of cost sharing frameworks, and a step-by-step process for first you need to figure out where your centers are. Next, you need to figure out what partners are in each center. Next, you need to make your list of costs. Next, you need to figure out how you're going to split and share those costs. So you'll have a much more robust guide to support this. In addition, we've developed an Excel workbook template of your one-stop operating budget, a way to collect and organize all of those pieces of cost information in one spot. And additionally, we're preparing a set of recorded training sessions specifically on the policy update and the development of your budget and infrastructure funding agreement. And these will be recorded that you can access anytime. I think right now we're at about 6 or 7 chunks that'll be about 10 to 15 minutes each that walk you through that guide and each step in the process of developing your funding agreement and your budget. The key updates that we have added to your guide, I think I spoke to all of these. Just adding kind of some of this overview context info we've shared today, your cost sharing framework, and then a case study example. So what that might look like at a center for each step. We did not want to share this 50-page document with you prior to this meeting because we really wanted to focus on the policy change piece first. We are sharing it after this meeting in its current draft state as another resource for you all to review, to learn more about the you're developing those pieces and provide feedback. And the last piece, just because I think to continue to reassure you that this is a learning process, you're not walking away today as the expert in MOUs and IFAs, but know that it can be done. There's a step-by-step piece to get you from point A to point B. And that's our approach to kind of developing those resources that we're also sharing with your partners and that we shared with your chief elected officials. So knowing that support, those resources are coming, but the other part of especially the valuable feedback you all can offer us today is anything that we can do to make this even stronger and more helpful for you all in implementing your new policy. I think I saw a couple of questions come through or potentially get answered. Is there anything I have missed?
I think, Darcy, I've been tracking them too. I think most of the questions have been answered. And I think maybe the one that might be worth just hitting on quickly as we move into discussion. Certainly this is covered in, Darcy, as you said, supporting resources. But there was a question around, what kind of costs are typically included in infrastructure costs, and is that part of an admin charge to support local board function? So we might just want to say a little bit about the kinds of costs that fall under infrastructure costs.
That sounds good. And I will actually
I could pop a link.
Do a little finagling with my screen to see if I can share with you all how we have that in the guide.
Thank you.
Let me see if I can make this big enough to see. And so again, you had a guide that looked similar to this before, and now it's a little bit more robust that first talks about your MOU, your MOU template instructions. That's what you had previously. And now we've added the key components of your infrastructure funding agreement, and then that 12-step shared cost framework with the example walking you through what to do for each step. And I'm gonna try to scroll like not too quickly, but I'm hoping that we've got some visuals in here that may help with that. And again, please feel free to take a look at this draft. And if there are questions that are not answered or ways that this can be a stronger resource for you all, after today's session, we have a survey link open. You can also email Wendy directly with any thoughts, because as we are now starting to develop that training content, we would be happy to implement your pieces of feedback. And I'm almost there. Well, not quite almost there. Sorry, I'm trying to balance that thing of scrolling slowly enough so no one gets too distracted or dizzy doing that with this part. But let me see. The types of change. I think I missed it. So here's what I can do. Let's open up to our other feedback questions, and then I'll take this onto my other screen and find the exact spot I'm looking for to be able to come back and answer this for you all.
Great, thanks. And if it's useful, I can also pop a link in, the link to the regs that just describes, broadly speaking, the kinds of costs that we're talking about here, if that would be valuable. So we're going to loop back on that question. That was a great question. Thank you for raising it. I'm just seeing if there's anything else outstanding before we dig in. So let's just start from the top here. I'm not seeing anything else outstanding. Let's just start from the top. First by saying, anybody have additional questions that have not been shared yet that you would like to share?
We kind of went through some stuff.
Overarching
I don't know
question.
how we can make money doing this with some of the
Sounds like
numbers
someone might
that we
be
Sounds
talked
like
about.
someone's on the phone.
I don't know
Why?
if that person has a question or
Well,
it needs to be on mute.
When I ran these numbers,
How many students do you count?
There
well,
might be a way to mute
have
that
to give
line. I
you four
can't
to
do
make
it, Wendy, but you might be able
$7,000.
to.
Okay,
I'm looking to
You okay
see
with that?
who it is. So I will be
And
I'll work
I'm
on that.
increasing the
Okay.
amount a little
Matt,
bit.
I think
Matt
it's
and
Matt.
Queso, if you
It's
can
Matt.
hear me.
Okay,
Matt from Iowa Western, you're not muted.
we're not gonna be able to charge companies that don't qualify for the 260F, the amounts that we do. and that we're going to make it work. Does that make
Matt, I don't know
sense?
if you can hear us, Matt Mancuso. I'm sorry if I'm
So we need to
mispronouncing your
have
last name.
more open enrollment
so is.
opportunities.
Sorry,
for-
bear with us for one moment.
Is that an opportunity for Iowa?
Hey, I'm just gonna give Matt a call.
Okay,
and,
I got
see
it.
if we can-
I got it, you guys.
All
Got
right.
it. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Okay. All right, Darcy, I see you jumped back.
Sorry about that. To add to our little moment of confusion, I did want to provide these examples of infrastructure costs versus what might be career services or other costs. So infrastructure costs are your rent, utilities, maintenance, the services that allow your infrastructure to be there. So that in terms of utilities, other things are, I think we gave like a snowplow removal example, or like landscaping, maintenance of a parking lot, pieces like that. Technology to facilitate access to the one-stop center, and your common identifier costs. That's what falls in your infrastructure bucket. It cannot be a personnel cost though. And then other costs may include intake, identification of services, and things like that. So I will reference you to the guide to see those examples, those pieces as defined, and then that is definitely a component that would be covered in the training.
Great. Thanks, Darcy, for finding that and sharing it. Okay, so let's jump back here. Other kind of overarching questions or comments that people want to float out there at this point. I think we've addressed everything in the chat, but if we haven't, please do flag it and we will loop back.
Did you mention why the governor is getting involved in this?
I can
Sure.
answer that question.
Thanks, T.
So by design, the governor should not be getting involved unless it's a last resort effort as a result of failure to reach consensus through local negotiations. And that can be as little as one partner not coming to agreement about the budget or the agreement as defined. Again, it's worst case scenario. So there are many mechanisms in place, starting with engaging with and bringing in your state level core partners or to assist and support in those discussions. Even also going, if that remains unsuccessful, to your Region 5 Department of Labor office to again come to support the successful negotiation and working through whatever that impasse may be. If you have done all of those things and you can still not come to agreement, that is the scenario where the governor would be involved because you have triggered what is called that state funding mechanism.
But again, just to emphasize, it's a great question, T, but just to emphasize what Darcy said, that really, as she said, that's really last resort. That isn't something that we, in our work anyway, we commonly see as something that has to happen. These things are typically negotiated locally. It's a great
All
question.
right, thank you.
Yeah, good question. So another question that came in, good one, thank you, from Darla. If you provide technology, how do you determine fair market pricing for yearly contributions? Great question. And I am not, I'm not sure that I am well positioned to speak to that specifically. I don't know, Darcy, if you have any thoughts that you want to share, or if we want to flag this one.
I think this would be one I would follow up with, or even work with the fiscal partner of your program. I'm confident there are resources and probably really mathematical scientific ways to do that. I'm not the one to tell you what those are though. But also, I don't know that we mentioned this earlier, in the developing of these policy recommendations and starting to think through how partners need to start getting ready to participate and especially support you all as local areas in this process. We did include the fiscal or financial representatives from the state level core partner team in working through and developing these recommendations. And they've also been reviewing the resources along the way. We probably mentioned that at the beginning. I just wanted to make sure to add that piece. So I can definitely put this on our homework follow-up list.
Good question. Thanks, Darla.
I believe in, this is Eric, I'm a board staff for Central Iowa and somewhat new to the system still. This will be my first time going through MOU and IFA. As we look at 2023 or 2024 moving forward, I believe that all of the core partners will be under the Iowa Workforce Development, and then we're using facilities that they lease and such. And I think that's how it has to be for the state. So I'm just wondering, I'm trying to think through here, what level are we coordinating at the local level, or inevitably is that gonna, somewhat just gonna be a state level philosophy regardless, being I don't know what leveraging power there is at the local level on this topic. Or can you help with that? I don't know, maybe that's the same dynamic as every other state, but maybe could you just speak to if that's unique or not and how that might impact local negotiation?
I have some thoughts on this in terms of just broader landscape, and it looks like Gretchen or Wendy may also want to chime in too. So we'll give you kind of a collaborative answer. It is not uncommon for a core partner to be a leaseholder, in a local workforce area, or even to occupy a larger footprint in a local area than others. And I think In terms of effectively fulfilling the locally driven nature of this process, that's where it comes back to being able to change your hat from state partner to local area partner and negotiator. And the infrastructure in terms of staffing and org charts that each of your partners have as far as who's coming to those meetings in your local area will differ. I can say in Oklahoma, in some cases, it was that state level partner chief financial officer who went to and participated in negotiations and development for each local area in the state. And while other partners may have had like a regional level of leadership that could present and represent their organization in these discussions. So the biggest thing in how we are sharing and supporting your partners in this is letting them know that they have to get ready to support you in this process. And that may mean developing their own internal processes of ensuring they have the information that you will need about what costs they are contributing at a center by center level, as well as having processes for being able to provide that information with you all. Those are the two big things that we have flagged for both your core and required partners to start thinking about now. But I'm gonna pause here to see, I think, if anyone else wants to chime in and give any more context for Iowa.
Yeah, I was just going to say what you said, Darcy. So Michelle or Wendy, why don't I kick it over to you?
Yeah, hi, everybody. This is Michelle McNerney. I'm sorry, I've been quietly listening in the background, but Eric, just as it relates to the realignment bill and Title II and Title IV operating under Iowa Workforce Development in the future, I mean, that will not change the local nature of this process. And so, yes, at a state level, all of those programs are operating in one agency, but it's still separate funding streams, right? It's still Title I funding being passed through to local boards. It's still Title II funding being competitively procured out to local service providers as Title II requires, right? It's still Title IV funding being specifically utilized for Title IV services across the state. So none of that will change. And I think that Darcy explained it really well. And one of the things that we've often talked about too is the sort of the separation of duties at IWD from a Title I and a Title III perspective, right? Which is, you know, my team, Wendy's here, Kyle Klaby-Kane is here. The policy team is the team that works with the core partners to develop this policy and procedure for the state, but it is not my team that would participate in local negotiations across the state. It's Linda Rouse's team and the finance team at IWD that would be doing that as a local partner. And so that will not change. And I don't anticipate that changing for any of the other partner programs involved in this, right? Because it's not just the 4 core partner programs, but it's all those required partners as well. And every local area has different required partners that are operating in the center and a part of the MOU. So yes, IWD will be at the table for these discussions locally, but it's something that has to happen 9 different times for the 9 different local areas, right? So hopefully that helps kind of answer your question.
Great, thanks, Michelle. Eric, any follow-ups on that? Did that help answer your question?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. That's a helpful comment. Appreciate it. The second part to that, and I think I'm going to ask this because I think some other board staff are interested in this as well. Is the WIOA, is it normal for WIOA, or is it normal for local boards to be funded by just the WIOA Title I contract in the areas, or is in other states alternative funding coming forward from like the other partners? Because as I think about this task at hand, this is all new work, and maybe it shouldn't have been new work, but this is new work for the most part on local volunteers now to carry forward. And so right now I believe they're just funded to carry out the work of managing the Title I contract, but as it relates to job center relations, should any, and I think that's kind of where I was coming with the question about is board staff or allowable in the infrastructure as it relates to boards are asked. And this is another one now being asked of them to do to support the function of the AJC system as a concept and not Title I.
Yeah.
So I think I heard a couple parts to that question. The one piece that I think I have seen been challenging in areas that seek to take on that system approach, even through like a staffing lens like that, is that infrastructure costs are very clearly defined as non-personnel costs. So it really can't cover like a staff member, a salary, any type of personnel costs to address that. And I have not heard, so I typically hear more of local areas seeking to share that personnel cost of a role like a one-stop operator or things like that. I have not heard that conversation in terms of board staff to speak to that part of the question. When but in terms of the infrastructure funding component, there is the expectation, and even in the federal guidance for each of our core partners, they are required to participate in the shared infrastructure funding of our centers and our system. In terms of other funding sources beyond that, that may not, that may be in like functions of the board or other pieces like that. I think that would fall a little bit outside of the line of MOU and IFA, where boards are incorporating as nonprofits or doing getting additional funding sources for additional types of work.
Thank you for fielding those questions. They weren't meant to be, making any sort of point, just to bring up some of the dynamics that might be in the room.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
and I think they're great questions, and those are topics and interests that we see local boards exploring in other areas. I think the best thing you could do as a local board that aspires to grow and expand, and if that's part of your vision for service in your local area, really focus on these foundational pieces of WIOA implementation, on getting them done well, and ensure that they're working really effectively, and that your local area relationships are really strong and you have those outcomes of serving your customers. I think that positions you really well to innovate and grow and expand in some of these other areas for board roles. I saw a question pop through the chat that I haven't read yet, and
Yeah.
I will mute while my dog adds input on this question too.
So Abby, thanks for this question. I think the one you're referring to, Darcy, is if classes and students served will be reduced due to funds being sent to the IFA, how do we address that? And I think I'll take just a little bit of a stab at this. And this isn't a technical answer on this question, Abby, but I think it's like a couple levels back. But I think the thing that's really positive for you all is all your local areas do have MOUs in place that do currently describe the ways in which you're collaborating in how your system operates and how you serve customers. So it's sort of like you've got that piece of this foundation in place in terms of the MOU, and then the IFA is a way to further articulate how you are going to support and kind of co-implement that. But it isn't as if you all haven't been doing that work in some ways already to date. So again, this is kind of just a higher level piece of the answer, not a technical one. But I think there are ways in which you all have foundations in place that can support kind of taking it further in terms of the IFA work. I don't know, Darcy, do you want to add to that?
I think this is also a great question to be having if you're coming to this as a core or required partner to continue to have internally and even upwards through your leadership who may have had input and be starting to prepare for some of these pieces. It can be really hard to plan or anticipate until numbers are together. And that's part of part of developing this budget is for each partner to start bringing to the table, here's what we already pay. So if we are paying for, an example I hear, like if we're, if 4 partners are paying for membership to the Chamber of Commerce or something like that, is that a cost that can be shared or consolidated on behalf of the local area? So one of the things that can come up in just developing that list of costs is realizing where there may be duplications that can be absorbed or made more efficient in your budget. And also, it's not as though, like, I don't think right now anyone is paying like nothing, right? I think every partner, every program in the system is contributing in that way. It's really about looking at what contributions you're making and how are we organizing this all for the purpose of the center to negotiate that that sharing across of our partners. So that I think that's a great conversation to continue to have through your state core partner, like leadership, title member, and then also bring those concerns to the negotiation table, but also start thinking about the costs that you do offer and contribute, whether it's salary of instructor for classes that may be offered in a center or things like that.
Great question. Thanks, Abby. Other questions that folks want to share today? We've got about 15 minutes left of our time. We want to talk about next steps, but I want to make sure that we focus on questions here. All right, so there's one. Okay. Darla, so the local board has responsibility for negotiating the MOU and the IFA and the one-step operating budget. What happens to regions whose boards are disbanding? Michelle or Wendy, I feel like, is there anything you want to say about that question?
Yeah, I can pop in. I'm not sure if Michelle is on right at this moment or not, but I think, Darla, that's a great question. And we're starting to come together to talk about some transition planning. And so I think that's something that I will take back with us and follow up on those particular questions, because that does kind of throw a wrench into some things and some of the local planning. So thank you for that question, and I will talk to the group about that and see if we can address that in the transition plans.
Thanks, Wendy. Appreciate that. And Eric, I'm also seeing your follow-up question about, if anybody can confirm that all the partners, not just Title I and Title III, are currently paying something. And again, I think I would just say that probably is a question that would be helpful to float up through the state core partners and to have locally. I don't feel comfortable answering that one. I don't know, Wendy, if there's anything else you want to chime in on with that one.
I think that we would have to look further into that per local area. I don't think I know that response off the top of my head, and it would be specific to each local area independently.
Yeah. And as we've shared, I mean, thinking through what's currently being done is something that I know the state core partner team has talked about and is gathering information around to be able to support you all in these local discussions. So, thinking this through and getting that information is part of the work, has been part of the work, and will continue to be part of the work moving forward. Okay, other key questions. These are really great. Other key questions or potential challenges or concerns that folks want to share, or ideas around areas of support that would be useful beyond the training that we've talked about, the recorded training, as well as the guide and other supporting resources. Okay. Well, maybe what I'll do, if it makes sense, I know we've gone through a lot today, and it probably is helpful to digest a little bit. I do want to make sure that we can talk about ways that you can submit follow-up questions or comments following today's session, because we certainly would welcome those as they occur to you following today's conversation. So let's just talk for a couple minutes then about what is coming down the pike Thanks again so much for this information and these great questions, and we do hope you'll keep them coming as we move forward. So in terms of the policy and supporting resources, again, we've touched on these pieces here today, but we will be, based upon the consultations that we've had, going back to the policy, refining and finalizing it as necessary. The team will be consulting with the state board, again, as I said, in April for their feedback, similar to the ways in which we've reached out to the other partner groups. And ultimately, the plan is for approval of that policy and issuance in June of 2023. So we are going to be doing ongoing work to support finalizing the combined MOU and IFA guide. And as Darcy mentioned, developing the recorded training for folks to be able to access beginning this summer. So we really would love to hear if you have additional questions or comments. You've got a couple different ways to submit those. The first is to weoagovernance@iwd.iowa.gov. Or we have developed an anonymous survey where you can submit questions, comments, and we would love to get your feedback that way. So we can pop these into the chat. Thanks, Darcy. And we would really appreciate it if you could provide feedback by April 1st. So that gives a little bit of time following today's session. We want to be able to get everything that we heard, look at it all together, and then continue with the work to finalize the policy updates as well as the supporting resources. So, and then yet to come in terms of consultation, again, will be the state board consultation in April, and then ultimately the plan for policy approval leading into June. Okay. So, and this gets really to the, this slide really gets to the good questions that you all shared around, starting to think about sort of how do you identify these costs, sort of who's paying what now, and this sort of information. So we have been sharing this in all of our consultations, that there are things that can be done now that, that partners can do to support the information needs that you all have locally around the one-stop operating budget and IFA development process. And this has been something that we have stressed, certainly with the state core and required partners, but with all of the groups that we have been consulting with. So, we're encouraging partners to provide the information and the data that's going to be needed for local area partners to complete infrastructure funding agreements, and to think about what processes they may need to put in place in order to get the data that you all are going to need in each of your local areas. So this has been something that has been emphasized heavily over the course of, excuse me, the last couple of months. I think we've also been encouraging partners to ensure that partners are able to participate locally in this IFA development process. So making sure that the staff that you'll be working with locally, who may represent state partners in some cases and other cases not, but that staff are knowledgeable and they're going to be able to make decisions, and they're going to be well prepared to participate in these negotiations over the next year or so, and that staff are really prepared to engage in these conversations. And some of the ways that we've encouraged partners to think about how to support local area partners in doing this work is thinking through costs like, what are the internet costs in centers? What are center outreach materials, center-wide outreach materials, not just partner specific, the kinds of things that Darcy mentioned before, Chamber of Commerce or similar kinds of dues that different partners may be paying, fees for customer assessment tools that centers might be using. These are the kinds of things that we've encouraged partners to be thinking about as they get ready to move into developing their IFAs. So, keep these in mind as well. You may think of some other things that you would like information around, but certainly this has been a key point of conversation to encourage partners to sort of start this work now so the information is available for you. All right. A couple of minutes left. Oh, we're at the thank you slide. So that is what is coming ahead in terms of the ongoing work. Again, we really would love your feedback as questions or comments occur to you after today's session. And let me just see, are there any additional questions or things that folks want to chime in on before we wrap up today? Okay. Well, I want to thank you all. You raised some great questions today. We really appreciated that you did, and the kinds of questions that you raised. This is going to be really, really helpful as we continue the work to get the guide ready and get the policy ready, as well as the other supporting resources. And we really do appreciate you spending this time with us today. So there is Wendy's contact info. If anyone has follow-up questions from today, please do feel free to get in touch with Wendy. And again, we really welcome your feedback at the survey link that we shared or to the governance email that we shared earlier. And thanks so much for being with us today. Wendy, and I don't know if Michelle is back with us. I'll turn it back to you to wrap us up before we close.
Thanks, Gretchen. Yes, thank you everybody for joining us and really great questions. There's definitely a few things that I want to follow up on. And like I said, if you have any questions, please reach out to me directly or send an email to the governance inbox like Gretchen said, or through that survey. And we will be taking a look at those. And if you can provide any other feedback by April 1st, that would be really great. And I will send out the PowerPoint and the resources, as well as where you can find today's recording after we wrap up today. So with that, thank you all very much. Have a really awesome afternoon. Bye.